last episode I noticed there was a bit of confusion with regards to what exactly I'm doing with this series. So, to clarify, the Re:Zero Cut content series is a summation of everything the anime skipped from the light novel and the manga. Whether it be full cut scenes, missed dialogue, or lore and world building, I try to be as detailed as possible. But that also may have been why episode 1 seemed more like a summary than actual new content. So for this episode, I'll focus less on the minor details and try to capture the more major points that were glossed over. Also, in the future, I'll make it clear with what was changed in the director's cut versus the original anime. For this episode in particular, there wasn't very much of that, but there was a decent amount of cut content from the epilogue. So be sure to watch till the end so that you don't miss those important story elements. Now, let's jump right back to where we ended last time, which was after Subaru died for the second time. After being woken up by the apple salesman, all the memories of his previous life quickly resurfaced. Memories of the horrible things he experienced only moments ago haunted him down to his very core. He could only think of how great it would be to return to his quiet shell of a life. All he wanted to do right now was simply forget. Seeing Amelia again did help with his confusion, but also quickly went to worsen it when she appeared all tense and defensive around him, eventually leading us right back through the same sequence of events and his inevitable third death at the hands of the thugs he decided to name Dumb, Dumber, and Dumbest. While dying for the third time, this was where Subaru began to notice that things were off. You see, up until now, Subaru hadn't yet realized that he'd been restarting every time he died. I mean, he hadn't even realized that he'd been dying yet. He sort of just ignored all thoughts relating to it, and tried to completely deny its possibility. But after hearing a very familiar phrase from the apple salesman one more time, he started to piece everything together. He decides that a good way to verify his suspicions was to ask for the date. Currently, it was Tammuz the 14th, about halfway through this world's year. But that didn't really mean anything to him, since this world likely didn't follow a solar calendar. That information pretty much only served to mark his current point in time. Anyway, all the evidence he needed was already there. Subaru had no choice but to accept that he had the power to revive on death. To him, it was an overpowered ability that would inevitably allow him to find the correct route and win. He wanted to refer to it as a form of time travel, but he knew from manga that that was a concept which was practically impossible to explain or justify. In fact, it's apparently considered an easier feat to recreate the entire world from scratch than go back in time. But being in a new world meant that nothing was off limits. The rules of his old world could very well no longer apply to this world, so for all he knew, anything could be possible. Subaru began to recall his past 3 lives. He compiled all the information he had and basically came to the conclusion that he should just avoid anywhere he would come across Elsa. He believed she was pretty much the type of character that always meant death when you met her for the first time. So if he wanted to live, then he figured he should just stay far away from Rom's loot cellar. But while pondering these past events, he realized that regardless of what he did, there were some things that just wouldn't change. One of which was that Felt and Rom were guaranteed to die if he just let things be. But would it really even matter if they were gone? I mean, they were just criminals after all. It was a perplexing thought that Subaru couldn't so easily come to a conclusion on. If this was back in Japan, then he likely would have done nothing, perhaps even scoffed at their predicament. You see, living a life behind a computer screen left him devoid of compassion and pity. He would read stories of people in similar situations like this all the time, never even giving it a second thought. He felt there was no need to get emotional over things like that, even finding it stupid when other people did. So to him, it really didn't matter if a couple of people he barely knew died. Well, that's how he thought in the old world anyway. In actuality, he despised it. It was much easier to ignore these things back when he wasn't directly involved. But now that he was confronted with a real-life situation, those feelings of compassion and pity bore a much heavier weight. This stirred a substantial change in one of his core beliefs, spurring Subaru to act in a much more selfless manner. Now, assuming that this was a timeline where events with Amelia happened exactly the same as the first one, he rushes to the alley where he first met her. Of course, rather than Amelia, he comes across Dumb, Dumber, and Dumbest instead. As it would seem, this was one of those unavoidable events. Subaru figured that the 3 of them had picked him as their target early on, then stalked him until he was alone. It would explain why during his third life, even though he was in a different alley, the thugs still managed to corner him. So Subaru would yell out for help, a cry which we saw no one immediately answer. Plan B was to then find an escape route. Sure, he could try to replicate the same scenario from his second life, but he didn't want to risk dying yet again. You see, there was no guarantee that he would get to restart for a fourth time. He remembered a saying about how Buddha only has the patience to save someone 3 times. And if that was in fact the case, then avoiding death this time should be a top priority. So as he was about to turn and run, that's when Reinhard made his entrance. He was a man with such a daring demeanor and polished appearance that Subaru felt ashamed to even stand next to him. He thought that this man must have been chosen by God to be the embodiment of perfection. So, after he easily scares away the thugs, Reinhard asks where Subaru was from. Since saying that he was from the Far East didn't work too well with Amelia, Subaru decided to answer that he was from a place so far east that no one had ever seen it before. Reinhard could only assume that he was from a place beyond the Grand Cascade, an iconic location that will become more prevalent in Season 2. Though, right now, Subaru had no idea what or where the Grand Cascade was. Really, all he could do was nod his head. Then, the rest of the conversation followed as we saw. Subaru then left to go in search of Felt's hideout. After questioning 4 people, he was able to verify its location and confront Felt. Though, instead of getting into a fight like they did in the anime, they get straight to making a deal. But Felt wasn't just going to take Subaru straight to the loot house. Even though Subaru wanted to get the deal done as quickly as possible, Felt was still suspicious of this strange person that she just met. And that became all the more clear when Subaru realized that Felt was walking him in circles. He was well aware that the direction that they were walking didn't quite match up with how he remembered. Plus, he had spotted the same graffiti twice now. Still though, he wasn't entirely sure that she was in fact leading him astray, so calling her out on it was going to be a slight bluff. Fortunately though, it worked, and it led to a change in Felt's attitude when Subaru said that he wasn't upset for being misled. He showed that he understood her situation, and he knew that all he could really do was work towards building a more trusting relationship with her. This did get Felt to open up a bit, making Subaru realize that he had the wrong impression on her this entire time. She wasn't just some girl whose life was centered on being greedy. No, that greed was a means to an end that supports a much stronger feeling of determination. And seeing Felt's resolve firsthand worked to boost his own determination as well. After that, they arrived at Rom's place and got his cell phone appraised. Subaru was about to grab the badge and leave when Felt found it a bit suspicious that he was in such a rush. Her persistence on the topic of his peculiar behavior made Subaru consider other options. He could wrestle Felt for the badge, but then he'd have to fight Rom as well. Other than that, his only other option was to be honest. You see, he understood why Felt was being so persistent. Her desire to get the best deal was backed by her determination to leave the slums. That's why she refused to let herself or Rom be tricked. So, because it had now come to this, it was clear that negotiations had pretty much failed. And to make things worse, Amelia had just arrived at the loot house as well. Bringing us to episode 3, starting life from zero in another world, covering the rest of volume 1 of the light novel. So, how did Amelia find the loot house so fast? Even under normal circumstances, without any Subaru-based intervention, it still should have taken a bit longer. Well, what happened was because Subaru rushed Felt straight from her shack to Rom's place, she wasn't able to hire people to divert Amelia away from the loot cellar. This was a precaution that she would always take, and it's what gave her enough time to get through negotiations with Elsa. But because that didn't happen and because Subaru wasn't distracting Amelia, she was able to find the loot house much quicker. That's why Felt thought that Subaru was working with Amelia. She couldn't help but feel that she'd been played, so she was ready to just give up the badge and leave. It was actually pretty surprising how easily Felt gave up, as if the slightest disadvantage had made her lose all hope. Regardless, the situation was slowly turning on Subaru. At least that's how it seemed until Elsa revealed herself from the shadows. When she began to mock Felt, Subaru was overcome by his own rage. He didn't even understand why. But all these emotions were just welling up inside of him. Seeing Felt's resolve get trampled over didn't sit too well with him either. Plus, he also carried a bit of a grudge from his last 2 experiences with her. But more than anything, he was buying time for Puck's attack, an unrelenting barrage of ice that looked far superior to any magic that Amelia had cast before. Unfortunately, Elsa's coat had a formula woven into it that allows it to block a single use of magic directed at it. So she was fine, and immediately went to engage Puck and Amelia in a 1v2. The thing about this situation though was that Elsa was at a complete disadvantage. You see, if multiple magic users are fighting alongside each other, then one just needs to defend while the other preps attacks. It's a solid strategy that maintains both offense and defense while leaving little to no openings. This was a fact that Rom knew all too well, which is why he was so hesitant to engage Amelia in a fight. He knew the best course of action was to just not fight at all. But with Elsa in the mix now too, he felt he should at least be helping Amelia. Though the fight was just so intense that there wasn't even any room to cut in. The only opening came when Puck froze Elsa's foot, giving him time to release what seemed to be his ultimate move. Elsa was only able to dodge by cutting off the sole of her foot, and luckily for her, by surviving that attack she also outlasted Puck, meaning now it was time for Rom and Felt to step in. But as we saw, Rom didn't last too long, and Subaru had to step in to save Felt. Amelia then took over the fight, while Subaru had to explain to Felt why she had to run. He was also closely monitoring Elsa's movements, noticing that she was becoming ever so sluggish. Clearly she was expending a lot of energy, so Subaru waited. He waited for Elsa's back to be completely turned. This would give him the opportunity to strike with Rom's club from a blind spot, and when the moment finally came, had that club been in the hands of a more experienced fighter, it definitely would have worked to take out Elsa. The thing is, Elsa clearly sensed Subaru's intent to kill, and was able to easily react to his amateur attack. Still though, it brought forth enough of an opening for Felt to get away, leaving Amelia and Subaru as the only two left to fight. So as the fight goes on, Subaru brings up the topic of Amelia's most powerful ability. She mentioned how it was truly only an absolute final option, one that supposedly relied on the power of her parents, an aspect that she didn't really like about it, so she preferred not to use it at all. But more importantly, it alludes to the potential of her bloodline, hinting at what seems to be a dominant heritage of magic ability. Now, given the situation she was currently in, the number of options left available to her were quickly diminishing. She could very well end up having to use that OP power of hers, and Subaru knew this, so all he could really do to prevent that was put forth his best effort. Normally he wouldn't have been much of a match for Elsa, but there were three factors in play which made it seem as if he was on equal footing with her. The first was Amelia's support. She was constantly firing ice attacks, causing Elsa to periodically retreat. The second was Elsa's lack of focus. You see, Elsa couldn't divert her full attention to Subaru. She had to constantly survey her surroundings to make sure that Puck didn't reappear. And finally, Subaru made sure not to put himself within lethal range of Elsa's daggers, not because he was fighting intelligently, but because he was too scared to fully commit to an attack. The fight wouldn't remain in that state for very long though. Elsa's attacks were unrelenting, and she was slowly but surely gaining the edge. Luckily for Subaru, a pillar of flame would burst straight through the ceiling. As the flame dissipated, smoke began to fill the room, and from the smoke, a shining figure with a burning aura began to emerge. It was Reinhard. You see, Felt had managed to find help, but more importantly, while she was running away, she was overcome by some unfamiliar emotions. Although she was sad about Rom, she also felt a similar amount of sadness for Subaru. Just by looking at him, she knew that he lived a sheltered life. He was someone who wouldn't stand a chance against Elsa, so she knew that eventually he was going to die. But why did that thought bother her so much? She only recently met him, so why in her heart does she care so much for his safety? She wasn't sure what made her think this way, but whatever it was, it kept her running until she was able to find help. Little did she know that this very moment would end up changing the fate of the world. Back at the loot cellar, Reinhard was fighting Elsa, though I don't think that you could even call it a fight. To the eyes of Subaru, every fantastical thing he'd experienced so far in this new world paled in comparison to how extraordinary Reinhard was. He was quite literally on an unfathomable level of power. Even while using a vintage sword that was wasting away in Rom's loot cellar, it was as if he was able to enhance it and use it to its utmost potential. His technique seemed to optimize on everything. His movements, his speed, his power, they were all nothing short of perfection. But even with all of that, Elsa wasn't going to go down that easily. She elevated her own abilities to what seemed was godlike. She began to move so quickly that the only thing Subaru could track was the sparks from when their blades collided. The time eventually came for Reinhard to reveal his true swordsmanship, and when he did, the space around Subaru became distorted. Not only was the room beginning to warp, but the temperature also began to drop. Amelia felt the need to lean on Subaru's shoulder. She seemed to have come up with a sudden fever, and her face showed she was in pain and out of breath. Reinhardt's interference with the mana in the room was having a negative effect on Amelia's well-being, thus why she needed Subaru for support. Light began to fill the room until all anyone could see was pure white. It felt as if the entire world was shifting. Then, when the light cleared, the distortions in space Subaru had seen were returning themselves back to normal. It was as if his attack had sliced through the very fabric of space. But even something like that wasn't enough to kill Elsa. She emerged from the rubble, then used her knife as a decoy to divert Reinhardt's attention, giving her enough time to get away. Everything after this was pretty much spot on, so we can skip all the way to after Subaru passes out, which brings us now to the epilogue. As Reinhardt stared towards the faint blue light given off by the moon, he related its radiance to water magic, the element of healing. He was both tense and worried at the same time, filled with regret as he shouldered all the blame for what had happened to Subaru. Only after Amelia told him that her healing was done was he finally able to let out a sigh of relief. He then immediately apologized for allowing such a thing to happen, kneeling in preparation for any punishment that Amelia was ready to demand of him. It was the most sincere form of apology that any knight could offer, but Amelia wasn't too fond of it. She never understood why knights like him would go so far as to try to take responsibility for every bit of suffering a person experiences. Even though it may not be the most chivalrous, Amelia found Subaru's method of demanding a reward after having saved her to be more appealing. So she found it frustrating that Reinhardt would want to be punished even though he had saved everyone. And with the way she phrased this, Reinhardt couldn't help but feel like he was being belittled. She spoke in such a grand manner that he could only assume it was because she was one of the chosen ones. That being the case, her safety was also a priority. So Reinhardt insisted that he have his knights escort her home. Considering everything that had happened, Amelia felt that that would be the safest option as well. Now, with nothing else to talk about, Reinhardt examines what was once the loot cellar, a building that he pretty much ruined on his own. The thing is, all this damage was because he was unable to control his own power. He made a slight miscalculation, and that resulted in the whole loot cellar being cut right in half. Had he miscalculated by even more, then the whole slum block would have been leveled. That's just the type of power that Reinhardt was dealing with, and he knew that he had to be more careful next time. Amelia then went over to talk to Felt, and while they were trying to make things right between them, Felt declared that she had zero intention of turning over a new leaf. Thievery was part of her life, it's how she got by, and she had no plans on stopping that. It was a difficult sentiment for Amelia to accept, but she understood that this was the hand Felt was given. Here was this 15-year-old girl doing everything she could to get by, so who was she to judge her way of life? Similarly, Reinhardt also felt pity. Even though it was his duty as a knight to prevent those crimes, he could only look on in silence. How could he rebuke Felt's way of life without providing a proper alternative? The capital was an unforgiving place, and Reinhardt knew that Felt wouldn't be able to survive there. Because of that, he was willing to let her be. But that all changed when she pulled out the insignia. It was only for a brief moment, but what he saw was a familiar flash of a red cross. Reinhardt sifted through his memories until finally finding the one that he wanted. Then, with a grip that could bend steel, he grabbed Felt by the wrist and insisted that she go with him. Of course she was reluctant, so Reinhardt was forced to render her unconscious by draining the power from her body, likely in a similar manner to when he affected Amelia by absorbing all the nearby mana. Now, when the badge was returned, on it could be seen a dragon that represented the state symbol of the Dragon Friend Kingdom of Lagunica. While in Reinhardt's hands, the red jewel in the center only gave off a dull glow. But when passed off to Amelia, it began to shine bright, as if it knew it was in the hands of someone who was its rightful owner. That was the indication that Reinhardt needed to act, setting much larger things into motion. And with that we end episode 3. Hopefully this time I didn't go too overboard with the details. I mean, I'd love to know if you think that I should keep trimming it down or maintain this level of detail. Whatever it is though, just feel free to let me know in the comments so that I know for next time. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!